honor to be with this organization, which has an amazing history, really dating back to the Civil War and American politics then. And particularly, as Andrea said, I've had an association with the League of Women Voters. I had an association with Andrea and you, and the programs we have put on together at Baltimore have been terrific. And you've all just done a wonderful service, both to our students and the community. Well, there's an easy talk you can give on the Electoral College, and it's the Electoral College is a really bad idea. And the first reason we know this is we look around the world. People are writing constitutions right and left, and nobody adopts the Electoral College. So, in fact, in Europe, Netherlands has written a new constitution in the last 15 years. No, there's no Electoral College. Germans have a very famous constitution, nowhere near the Electoral College. In Central America, they write new constitutions every 5 years. It actually turns out the average national constitution lasts 17 years. So in fact, you can do a thriving business as a constitution writer. But while there are bits and pieces of the United States Constitution that show up elsewhere, the Electoral College never does. And in fact, while every state in the Union has counties, so every state in the Union could conceivably have an Electoral College, none of the 50 states who combined over the past 225 years have produced approximately 500 constitutions. None of them have adopted anything like the Electoral College. We go into civil society. The League of Women Voters has a constitution, has a bylaw. You don't adopt the Electoral College. To the best of my knowledge, I looked at high school constitutions for a project. Nobody adopts them. Chess club constitutions, nobody adopts them. So one has to sort of say simply, if this was so good of an idea, you would think one country, one state, the Bridge Club of Topeka, Kansas, would adopt it. It hasn't. And I think the reason is obvious. There are two basic kinds of democracies. One is the one we're mostly familiar with. It's called majoritarian democracy. It's pretty obvious what that means. The idea is the policy, the person, the X most people like should rule. So if your family decides you're going to teach people a lesson in democracy, and Sunday night dinner is going to be decided by majority vote. If you have my family, 3 children, 2 adults, outnumbered, you always lose 3-2. And it's hot dogs. But there's another form of democracy that's popular in many countries. We call it consensus democracy. The idea of consensus democracy is not to ensure what a majority of people do wins, because we worry about majority tyranny, but the idea is to maximize the number of people that influence public policy. So imagine your family decided you would democratize Sunday dinner on a consensus democracy model. One of the things you might do is say, okay, Rebecca, you choose the first week. Mom chooses the second week. Abby, Dad, Naomi, and rotate. Everybody chooses once. Now that means you're still going to have lots of hot dogs, but at least 2 out of the 5 weeks there'll be a vegetable. With some luck. And then, what happens in these systems is inevitably trading. So maybe if Rebecca agrees to have a vegetable, Mom and Dad will agree, instead of having, fish, which they don't like, hamburger. But as long as they're vegetables, so you trade off and everybody influences policy. Now the problem with the Electoral College is very simple, which is it doesn't fit either of those models. So to begin with, it's obviously not majoritarian, as we've learned, but it also doesn't maximize the number of people who influence policy. It's not that New York can go to Utah and say, okay, Utah, we know you're very conservative, we know you're very liberal, but let's make a trade. You guys don't vote for Trump, we won't vote for Sanders. We'll find somebody in between, we'll agree on that. You can't do that. The Electoral College doesn't permit the sort of bargaining that might get to a middle solution that even if it's not the one most people prefer, it's the one most people can live with, which is a virtue of consensus democracy. Now I mentioned those are the easy dives. And there are two problems with focusing my talk on the easy dives. The first is, in fact, they're easy dives. It's sort of like speaking out against the Electoral College is a bit like speaking out against corruption. Namely, I'm opposed to corruption. On the other hand, I don't have any new reasons for being opposed to corruption. I'm opposed to politicians having their hand in the till for the same reason all of you are. The difference being an academic is I can state those reasons in an hour and a half, whereas you would take 15 seconds to say the same thing. The second is what I particularly do is constitutional history, or because I'm a political scientist, we call it constitutional development. It's the same thing as constitutional history, but if I call it development, I'm allowed to publish in a political science journal. You have to simply know the way the ethics of the profession work. And what I'd like to give you is something is, why do we have an electoral college? Why did it make sense to people in 1787? And why did we keep it? If it's so obviously stupid, wrong, why do we keep it? Turns out the framers had 4 reasons for the Electoral College, some of which we now think are pernicious, some of which just turned out to be wrong, and one of which is interesting, but it turned out the Electoral College didn't work to do it. First reason was actually, one reason why they had the Electoral College is they didn't think it was particularly interesting. Because everybody knew that George Washington was going to be the first president, no matter what system you use, barring flipping a coin. Any remotely democratic Republican system you're going to use, George Washington wins the presidency for as long as they want it. And the framers assumed that nobody else would have such a national reputation that they would get a majority of the Electoral College. They assumed political disorganization, sections, that in fact the House of Representatives and the Senate would be deciding presidential elections after Washington for the foreseeable future. And what they overlooked and what they inadvertently created was a two-party system. And here's why the Electoral College creates a two-party system. To win in the Electoral College, you need a majority. It is not like a parliamentary system, think England, think Israel, where in fact if you can get 25% of the seats, you can bargain with another coalition. No, you've got to win the majority. In a system where majority wins, what we have learned is inevitably the system encourages two parties. Third parties don't last very long. They tend to be transitional things. So for example, a lot of white Southerners, at some point they feel abandoned by the Democratic Party. They vote for George Wallace. When George Wallace leaves, they're Republicans. In my actual case, I was a Northeastern Republican starting out my life. My politics were not Ronald Reagan. There was John Anderson. Voted for John Anderson in 1980. By the way, the ultimate League of Women Voters candidate, my judgment. Looking at all the nods. And then said, okay, now I've got no John Anderson. I guess I'm a Democrat. But that's what third parties do. And so the Electoral College actually created the party system, but the party system had the effect that, contrary to what the framers thought, now the Electoral College was almost always going to decide the national election. So the first interesting feature of the Electoral College was, while the framers thought it was merely a screening device, this is how we'll get the 4 or 5 people that are actually going to be the contenders. It has turned out to be the decisive mechanism. And so, in fact, the purpose the Electoral College was supposed to serve, it doesn't serve any longer. It doesn't simply screen, it chooses. Well, the second reason the framers wanted the Electoral College is slavery. Now, to understand this, we need to understand the way the framers thought about slavery. The framers primarily weren't interested in what we might call Bill of Rights protections for slavery, i.e. a provision that says you can't do this. What the South wanted was political power. And they assumed population was going south, and what Southerners said is, with population going south and the 3/5 clause, the Electoral College guarantees us the presidency. We will always control the presidency. That's what made the Electoral College attractive. Notice the South needs a 3/5 clause, which, by the way, adds numbers of representation, goes into the Electoral College, because if it's a straight majority vote, now there are more people in the northern states. But if we augment the southern share of the Electoral College by 3/5, the South wins. And most of you, I suspect, know the Revolution of 1800, where Thomas Jefferson decisively defeats John Adams. Not so decisive. Take away the electoral votes slave states got for their slaves, and John Adams wins the election. And by the way, we never get the Louisiana Purchase, which enables the expansion of slavery in the Southwest and eventually leads to the Civil War. American history is entirely different. But this one right in mind we can toss out. Okay, if they had this institution because it was designed to protect slavery, that's not really a very good reason for having it today. It should have been thrown out when we abandoned slavery. We're about to find out in about 5 minutes why that's not the case. A third reason commonly given is small states. That small states needed representation. Actually, it turns out there's something very interesting about most small states. Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Maine is coming. They're all northern free states. It turns out, Madison admits it, the small states, even Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, are free states. Everybody assumed, by the way, Georgia was going to, population was flowing to Georgia. Population flowing to North Carolina. So first, the small states are actually free states. But beyond that, as Madison wound up saying, what does New Jersey have in common with New Hampshire outside of new? Not much. What does Wyoming have in common with Rhode Island? Not much. It turns out being a small state is sort of like being a state with a basketball team that wins more than it loses. It's completely random. You have nothing else in common. It's like being a state that has red and blue on your flag, rather and no green, if you have nothing in common. So what do small states mean today? Because we have the Senate, the Electoral College has one interesting feature. It turns out when the United States divvies up funds, the funds tend to be divvied up equally by states. So, for example, it will turn out that Wyoming gets the same share of mass transportation funding as does Virginia and New York. Now we know why the Metro is what it is, but my guess is the Wyoming, it runs really well. It gets even worse. It turns out Wyoming gets its equal share of anti-terrorist funds, because we all know ISIS just wants a vacation in the mountains. So that's the consequence of this. And once again, one may say there may be some benefits to federalism, but Wyoming doesn't need and the same share of anti-terrorist and mass transportation funds as New York and Virginia. The last reason, and the one that's most complicated, is the Electoral College of the system was designed to screen out candidates who lack what the framers' generation would call virtue. The presidential system was designed to get a certain kind of character. First, the electors were expected to consider character. They weren't expected to cast automatic votes. Then the Senate and the House would also consider character. So we'd have a screening device that might prevent certain unknown people from becoming president. Names will not be mentioned. Well, it turns out doesn't work like that in part. The Electoral College now automatically votes, and nothing ever goes to House of Representatives. And it's also the case that while the framers had a notion of leadership, to some extent, in a modern democracy, our notion is the leader is the person who's the most popular. And it's very, very difficult talking to students to say there are actually people more qualified than others, that in some ways Andrew Jackson set the tone for modern democracy. We've had nobody more qualified in the presidency than John Quincy Adams, and I would argue almost nobody least qualified than Andrew Jackson. But Jackson was popular. He said what democracy means is the people vote, they get to choose the leader, and that's pretty much a modern understanding. So the one feature of the Electoral College that might seem attractive is inconsistent with modern understanding. It doesn't work. Well, why do we still have it? Let's fast forward to the Civil War and the Republican Party. And one thing we know about the Republican Party is these are people who are not shy about amending the Constitution. Moreover, if you study Republican Party rhetoric, they are big on majority rule. The Republican critique of the South was that a bunch of plantation owners are ruling the entire South and ruling all of us because of all these constitutional problems. When Thaddeus Stevens introduces the 14th Amendment to Congress, he says the goal of the 14th Amendment is to ensure the perpetuity of the Republican Party. Now, this is not a crass thing. His idea is very simple. We have just passed a new amendment outlawing slavery. Some people liked that amendment. They're called Republicans. Some people hated that amendment. They're called Democrats and Southerners. If Republicans continue to rule, the 13th Amendment will be enforced. If Republicans stop ruling, then, in fact, the 13th Amendment will never be enforced. He was largely right. So for the framers of the 14th Amendment, and this is the next book, it turns out all the rights we care about, they never speak about. What they spoke about is the way in which, by one, getting rid of the 3/5 clause, and then telling southern states, if you disenfranchise African Americans, you will lose that share of representation in the Electoral College and in the House of Representatives. That would guarantee Republican ascendancy. Why? Southerners would have a horrible choice. They disenfranchise African Americans. They lose 30 votes in the House of Representatives. They lose 30 votes in the Electoral College. That means they're a permanent minority. Republicans win all the time. They enfranchise African Americans. They get the 30 votes. The problem is, 15 of those votes are going to be Republican, because that's where African Americans are going to vote. So the idea was the 14th Amendment worked on that dilemma. Well, why not get rid of the Electoral College? And here I can solve a great mystery for you that I know all of you have stayed up awake nights pondering. Why is there a North Dakota and a South Dakota? Right? Does anyone know the answer? Why we have both? Not simply Dakota. It's not like they both were booming metropolises. There are just so many people. Well, the answer is Republicans had another strategy for retaining power. It turns out, with the exception of Utah and Montana, all the West is Republican. And so what Republicans begin to do is admit underpopulated states right and left, drawing boundaries. So you've got this big Dakota territory, but why have a state called Dakota with 2 Republican senators and 3 votes in the Electoral College when you can have North Dakota and South Dakota with 4 Republican senators and 6 votes in the Electoral College? And by the way, if you think this doesn't matter, you may remember that even after a lot of chicanery, Rutherford B. Hayes wins the 1876 election by 1 electoral vote. That's also because 7 months earlier, the Republicans rushed in a bill for Colorado statehood. There were almost no people in Colorado, but they got a Republican state, 3 more electoral votes. If we get rid of the Electoral College, the Republican advantage out of the West collapses. Now, what I want to highlight for this is the Electoral College remains, not because anyone thinks it's any good, but historically the in-party has always gotten in, winning there, and it's very difficult to convince politicians that if you win under an electoral system, well, that system is still unfair, we ought to change it. So, right, I'm a sports fan. It's not the league champion who says we ought to change the rules. It's the people who finish. So right now, for example, Democrats, we ought to get rid of the Electoral College. But I promise you, if Democrats start winning the Electoral College and lose the population vote, they'll admit they were wrong all these years. And so, the challenge for the League of Women Voters, for groups that care about the integrity of an electoral system, is how do you overcome the desire of the yins to remain in and maintain the system that keeps them in? Thank you very much.